decides to leave it in the bank. By October 1914, the Treasury had issued over $380 million in emergency Aldrich Freeland currency. In today's money, that is the equivalent of flooding the system with tens of billions of dollars in a few weeks. It was a massive injection of liquidity. And it worked perfectly. There was no general suspension of payments. There were no major bank failures. The interest rates, which had spiked at the outbreak of war, began to drift down. The gold outflow was stemmed not by hoarding, but by the confidence that the U.S. system was solvent. This was the supreme irony of the moment. The Aldrich Freeland Act, written by a conservative Republican senator to protect the interests of the money trust, was used by a progressive Democratic administration to save the country using a mechanism that was essentially fake central banking. It proved that an elastic currency was the antidote to panic. It proved that the government, not private bankers, had to be the ultimate provider of liquidity. But what about the Federal Reserve? Where was the real central bank during all of this? It was frantically trying to get dressed while the house was burning. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington was officially sworn in on August 10, 1914, right in the middle of the crisis. But they had no power. The 12 regional banks didn't even have offices yet. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York was operating out of a temporary office with a handful of staff. They watched from the sidelines as McAdoo and the Aldrich Freeland notes saved the world. However, the existence of the Aldrich Freeland currency gave the Fed the most precious resource of all, time. Because the panic had been quelled, the Fed didn't have to launch prematurely. They could take the months of September and October to finalize their bylaws, hire their staff, and set up their ledgers. They didn't have to be the firefighters. They could focus on building the fire station. Finally, on November 16, 1914, the Federal Reserve Banks officially opened for business. It was a quiet affair compared to the chaos of August. The new Federal Reserve notes began to flow into the economy. And as they did, the emergency Aldrich Freeland notes began to flow back out. The law had been designed with a sunset mechanism. The emergency notes carried a tax, a penalty interest rate that started low but rose every month they remained in circulation. This was brilliant engineering. It meant that banks would use the emergency money when they were desperate. But as soon as the crisis passed and normal rates returned, it would become too expensive to hold the notes. The banks would voluntarily collect them and return them to the Treasury to be retired. By the summer of 1915, almost all of the $380 million in Aldrich Freeland currency had been withdrawn and destroyed. The act expired for good on June 30th, 1915. It had lived a strange, quiet life for 6 years, exploded into glorious action for 6 months, saved the American economy from total ruin, and then vanished into the incinerators of history. The legacy of the Aldrich Freeland Act is profound, yet almost entirely invisible. It bridges the gap between the 19th and 20th centuries. Before 1908, an American panic meant a crash, a depression, and suspension of payments. After 1914, the panic meant an injection of liquidity. The act taught the American government how to be a lender of last resort. It broke the psychological barrier that said money had to be tied to gold or government bonds. It proved that money could be tied to the commercial assets of the nation, to the actual business being done by its citizens. Without the Aldrich Freeland Act, the panic of 1914 would likely have forced the U.S. off the gold standard. It would have shattered the U.S. banking system just as the Allies needed American loans to fight the war. It is not an exaggeration to say that if that law had expired on June 30th, 1914, as originally planned, the outcome of World War I might have been different.